I really need to talk for just a moment about kind of the state of how I see the book hobby. Now, I will say, kind of from the start, that this is an introduction to handbook collecting. It's definitely not the definitive story on handbook collecting because I don't consider myself expert on handbooks. I've had some good handbooks. I've learned a little bit about handbooks and I can talk about it a little bit. But the reality, and this may not really be seen by those who aggressively collect handbooks, but the reality I look at from a new collector, we'll just say a new collector's perspective, is that there is no literature available to anybody interested in collecting handbooks today. And I'm sure some people will argue with that. Now, being a little bit more of an advanced collector maybe than someone who just says, oh, I really would like to collect some handbooks. I'm vaguely aware of the Kahuna catalog. I don't have one. And I would say that 99% of collectors from the last 25 years have no idea what the Kahuna catalog is. There's one digital resource that I will cover at the end. And without that digital resource, it would be, in my opinion, impossible for someone to start collecting handbooks today. And it's a great digital resource, but it's not widely known to most people. And it's not what we think of as like a recognized national database. So the problem that I'm seeing is that, 99% of people who would have an interest in maybe starting to collect handbooks have no way of starting to collect handbooks. And as a result of that, I think as a direct result of the lack of promotion that has gone into handbooks, handbook collecting is dying. I think it's fallen off a cliff and it's rolled over dead. It's just dead. These handbooks no longer bring anywhere near what they used to bring in terms of price. They certainly don't bring what they should bring in terms of rarity because there are some very rare handbooks. And I feel like I'm having to do this presentation because there are a couple experts who collect handbooks and no one has made, in my opinion, a concentrated effort to promote handbook collecting. So, and it could be for any whatever reason. It's really none of my business other than just as a new collector or anyone interested in figuring out what handbook they have. In my opinion, it's just about impossible. So with that very long rant out of the way, I'm going to get into this and I'm going to talk about basically the beginnings of handbook collecting. So one of the things you have to know, and I tried to make it pretty simple, is you have to know what handbook is in front of you. And there's a couple ways to do so. For the early editions, a lot of the times it will have somewhere on there, like here's a 1911, and it actually says 1911. What you have to watch out for is you don't want the copyright date. What you want is you want the printing date. You want to know when it was printed. For the early handbooks, a lot of times it's somewhere within those first couple pages. Here's the 1911. It just has 1911 on the first page, and we'll talk a little bit more about how some of the varieties can be determined, some of the printings can be determined. The next one over, you see it actually says, this is on one of the first pages of the book, it says on there 5th edition, first printing, June 1948, 840,000 copies. For a long time, Boy Scouts was very good about telling you, we made this many copies of this handbook, it's this printing, and so on. Some of them you'll flip, and it's like, first couple pages, there'll be a long list of the printings of the handbook, and the last one on the row, that one is the one that you're holding. So that's one way. And then on the right-hand side over here, you'll see this is kind of a later one, but the important thing to pay attention to is where it says, it says copyright 1998. Well, it wasn't printed in 1998. That was the copyright date. you see that number a little bit lower down where it's 250M1004. Okay, so 10004, that's what I want you to focus on. The 250M is saying that there were 250,000 printed. The M is, in this case, is standing for 1,000 to show that there were 250,000 printed of this handbook printing. But the 10 is the month, so October, and the 04 is the year. So even though it says copyright 1998, it was printed in October of 2004. And it is nice that they say 11th edition, 6th printing, a little bit off to the right-hand side. So let's go ahead and get into what is called the original edition. Now this is, once again, some of this is a little bit of Larry griping. And I don't even know who I'm griping at because I don't know who came up with some of this stuff or if it's just whatever it is. I don't like that this is called the original edition. And the reason I don't like it is because the next edition is called the first edition. My problem with that, and I understand the kind of some of the logic. Okay, it's the original edition. This handbook, when it came out, it was really kind of a stopgap method. They needed a book, and they really hadn't had time to write one. So what they did is they took maybe about 30% or so of Baden-Powell's Scouting for Boys. They took a lot of Seaton's Woodcraft Indian, the Birch Bark Roll, his book, and they combined them together. And they came up with the Boy Scout Handbook. And you can see they literally copied the cover from Scouting for Boys. My problem with calling it the original edition is that from a collecting standpoint, you're starting your catalog at 0. So you're collecting, if you're thinking, okay, I'm collecting this edition. Well, it's before the first edition. It's the original edition. And it's like, okay, but so you're starting your collector database off at 0, which is just not something you normally do. If you have what's the first flap? Well, it's 1. You start off at 1. And so this whole system to me is a little confusing, and we'll get into why some parts of it are a little confusing later. But so anyway, from a collecting cataloging standpoint, I just don't like calling it this, but it is referred to by the book collectors, whoever they might be, as the original edition. The next thing I'll say is it is interesting that the book, and I have to say it's because it was authored by Seaton, but it's just interesting that you really don't see Beard's push of this. He had the Sons of Daniel Boone program, and he had the book The Boy Pioneers. And Beard and Seaton were both involved with Silver Bay. And Silver Bay Scouts were asked to bring Scouting for Boys. They were asked to bring the Birch Bark Roll. They were asked to bring the Boy Pioneers. They were. Beard's influence was seen early on in the program, but his influence isn't really seen in the first handbook, which is just kind of interesting. I will note that the first aid portion of the handbook references the YMCA. It doesn't actually tell you how to do any of the first aid. It just basically tells you how to take a first aid course through the YMCA. It tells you to go take a course. That's just really interesting to me. I wondered if some of that had to do with Edgar Robinson. He was the first secretary of the Boy Scouts, and he worked at the YMCA before he switched over to that role, and then he went back. But that was when the headquarters of the Boy Scouts was at the YMCA offices, basically, for that very short period of time. But I just wondered if that was some of his influence kind of coming in of, just referring the Scouts back to the YMCA program. So, talking about variations, this guide, if you will, this PowerPoint, is going to cover what I would consider if you want to collect the major types, okay? So if you wanted one of these original editions, any of these variations would do. And we're not going to get really into special printings. But if you wanted to have every 1910 to 1911 handbook, every one of this type, there are 8 possible variations. Now, within that, there's softbound and hardbound. There's two author and single author. And this style was actually issued into March of 1911. There's also some special editions, and we'll talk more about them in a little bit. Excluding the special edition runs, which were much smaller, the print runs for these were between 5,000 to 10,000. I've tried to include the print runs on some of these to give you some idea of scarcity between the different printings. I understand that it's not going to be perfect by any stretch, but I just wanted to try to give you some sort of reference to, okay, well, they made 5 to 10,000 of this one, they made 50,000 of this one, they made 100,000 of this one, to give you some sense of where the scale of scarcity on these. So then we get into the first edition. So this is really the first book that was actually written, I would say, from scratch for Boy Scouts of America, but they took some stuff from the original edition. It was written by an editorial board. Seton was not involved. My understanding is Seton was not involved in the writing process of this book. He probably wanted to be, but he was not involved in the writing process of this book. It's the only handbook that has photographs until the 10th edition. And the photographs were replaced with line art because they were really bad. And there were a lot of problems with this first edition. Basically, the gist of it I got from reading a little bit of history on it was that the editorial board really didn't edit anything. They just there's lots of errors in it. I think there were errors regarding some of the dates of the Mexican War. I mean, factual history. But there were lots of things. The cover art was by Gordon Grant, who I had never heard of. But I thought that that's kind of seen as an iconic piece of art. At least to me it is. And I'd never heard of him. I thought that was just kind of interesting. The first edition was from 11 to 14. There are 32 possible varieties. There's, of course, softbound and hardbound ones. I would say the two kind of main types, if you wanted to say, I'm going to cover collect and I want the main types, I would say an olive cover and a maroon cover. The print runs on these were drastically different. So you had anywhere between 4,500 to 6,000 on some of these prints, or 60,000 on some of the prints. And I think that shows just how the movement changed from 1911 to 1914. Even though this is the same edition, you can imagine that some of the later printings are many times more common than the earlier printings, even though they were only separated by a year or two. So second edition, this came out in 1914 to 1927. This cover art is very famous by J.C. Leyendecker. It's the cover from the Saturday Evening Post. And it's kind of famous in a way of it's wrong because he's doing semaphore signaling and he's not signaling anything. That doesn't exist in the American semaphore code or whatever. It doesn't actually mean anything. And we'll get into why that's important to know in just a moment. The photographs, like I said, from the first edition, they were all replaced with line drawings in the second edition. The photographs were just not of a quality that was really acceptable for the publication, so that they had to replace them. There are 68 possible variations. Some of the main, I'll say kind of like the if you wanted to do a typeset or you wanted something a little bit beyond just one of each edition, is they come in different color covers. They come in gray, they come in rose, they come in red, they come in pale green, they come in olive green. There's a lot of other changes. One of the big changes, if you want to collect covers, is that there's some font changes, okay? So like in the olive green covers, some of them are in a scripted font, some of them are in a blocky font. If you get into trying to identify all these variations, you get into having to, okay, it's this many pages. Let's just say it's 572 pages versus 604 pages. Okay, some of them are slightly different in pages. some of that on some of them has to do with how many ads the book has. A lot of these handbooks, they have ads in the back of the book, and they might be for your bicycle tires or for a pocket knife or for whatever. These ads, depending on who in what year we're getting these ads in the back of the book, paying for them, the ads would change or they'd be updated. And they might go from half a page to a full page, or they might go from a full page to half a page. And so some of that, I think, plays into some of the differences. But really, the main difference, to me at least, when I was looking at collecting these, was I just wanted one of each different cover. And I did try to get them even when it was like a font change on the cover. Once again, the print runs are pretty different. The 15,000 print run, yes, that was a full print run, but it was a reprint print run. Most of them tend to be towards the larger end of this scale, which is 112,000 with the most of any second edition print run. But there was a full print run that was labeled as a reprint print run, and it was 15,000. So, but these were done from 14 to 27. Here's the Saturday Evening Post on the left, and you can see it's the same semaphore flags as the first cover. Then they switched it to L, and that's a red one. There is a rose one that could easily be mistaken as like a faded red, but it's actually the same with the one on the right where it's kind of like a light green. They do come like that, and it would be easy for someone who doesn't know what they're looking for to think that that's just a faded of the darker green. The darker green on the far right is the blocky letters compared to the scripted letters. So then we get into third edition. Now this is kind of interesting because this handbook, which was used from 27 to 40, so right up into World War II, this handbook was really, it was called revised, but it was the first major rewrite. They really put a lot of effort into this handbook. Overall, it was a massive improvement. On the cover, this is just iconic art. You have the cover art by Norman Rockwell. I did not know that he did not paint this for the handbook. I never knew that until recently when I was looking some of this information up. So this is actually the art for the 1929 Brown and Bigelow Scout Calendar, which was titled Spirit of America, painted in 1927. Really interestingly, Lindenberg replaced it a conquistador between the initial sketch and the final painting. I thought that was cool. So later printings of the third edition are the first printings that actually tell scouts like the official way to wear a neckerchief. You always think of in early scouting now, people don't wear a neckerchief much anymore, but you think of early scouting, oh yeah, they wore neckerchiefs. Well, according to the handbook, it really wasn't required or considered like official uniform wear to wear the neckerchief until this handbook. This is the first one that actually emphasized that. I thought that was kind of cool. So there's 40 possible variations. A lot of these are all minor. This is the only cover art that's just the regular handbook cover art. You have a total page count and ad changes, and the back cover changed a little bit. But if you just wanted one to represent this edition in your collection from the front, they're all going to look the same for the regular handbook editions. And that's where we get into special editions. We're not going to really cover these. Every handbook has some kind of special edition handbook that was issued for some special reason within it. In general, these were made in much smaller print runs. Okay, they may be the same handbook. They may have a couple things added to it, like the Waldorf Astoria, it's in a different binding. It has the menu for the night added to it, if I remember right. The 1935 silver cover has a couple pages in the front where it talks kind of like about why it's a special edition and so on. But there's two of the original edition that are considered special editions. The revised one is this one on the right with the silver cover. It's a very iconic handbook. Only 5,000 were printed. You think about that, and you think about over 3,500 third edition handbooks are printed. Usually a 100,000 print run. Some of the ones at the end were 200,000. And then you consider that many being printed in a regular print run. 39 variations of the handbook, which are all out of these 100,000 print runs. And then you have this one that's only 5,000 printed. And that's when you start to realize that these special editions can be very, very scarce to ever come across. You just never come across them. If you go through 1,000 handbooks, it shows you may never come across some of these. And as a result, a lot of them do carry a significantly higher value premium. They're the ones that people who are still collecting handbooks, they're usually these ones that they're missing, these various special editions. So, you know, and especially just look at the Waldorf Astoria, 300 printed. You compare that to a regular original handbook, you're talking about, 5,000 to 10,000 of each of those printings compared to 300. That was a one time, and it went to special people who, some of them weren't necessarily, scouters. They may have been influential members of the community who were invited. So it just, once again, some of these are really rare, and every one of these could have their own little presentation. So I'm not covering them beyond this in this presentation. 4th edition, 1940 to 48. The cover art's by Norman Rockwell. Once again, it was one of his calendar paintings that was done in 39. This is the Scouting Trail. I just never realized that Rockwell did these artworks not for the handbook. I just assumed they were done for the handbook and then used for other art. I just thought this was interesting. Some collectors combine the 3rd and 4th editions into one edition. I've always considered them separate just because they have different covers, and they do have some major revisions that came out in 1940, but apparently some collectors kind of combine them. There's 28 possible variations. This is where it gets a little confounding, and someone who knows more about handbooks, because I certainly don't consider myself an expert, may be able to explain why this is this way. But towards the very end of the handbook, you'll see on a page there'll be a star, and there'll be either 1 star, 2 star, 3 stars, or 4 stars. Okay. Well, collectors collect those stars, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And the problem you have with this, at least from my understanding of looking at some of the print run quantities, is that some of this variation was within a single print run. There was this variation. So for this, I just said that the average print run for each of these 28 possible variations, if you wanted to collect every one of them, and you want to collect every one of them with 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, and 4 star, it would be about 125,000 just across the board. I don't know if that's how accurate that is. Like, I don't know if 1 stars are harder than 4 stars. I have no idea. But roughly 125,000. This is the other thing I'll mention. The Boy Scouts of America, on the page where they put the printing information in the handbook, where they put that nice little list, at this point in time, they are still counting this book that collectors are calling the 4th edition. They're counting it as the Boy Scouts as the 1st edition in the book. They're saying that this is the 39th printing of the 1st edition handbook. Okay? That's really confusing as a new collector. It just doesn't make, it doesn't make sense not to subdivide this number. So some collectors do subdivide it as this is the 7th, the 39th printing in the book is actually the 7th printing of the 4th edition. I recently had somebody, I'm sure they thought they knew a lot more than I do, and they probably do, but they reached out to me and informed me how wrong I was, because I had a very early handbook available, and they told me it was the 15th edition. I said, well, sure, it is the 15th edition, but it's also the what I had it labeled off, which was the such and such, maybe 5th printing of the 2nd edition or whatever it was. So, they were right, but I was right too. So, I like counting, personally, I like counting the printing number based on the actual edition that it is, or that we're considering it today, which conflicts a little bit with the book. So here's the 5th edition. This was printed, we're post-war now, so 48 to 58. And the cover art is kind of interesting here. Don Ross was the BSA art director, and he did the cover on the left. We don't know if he did the cover on the right. He may have done it. Don't know. The first cover was only used for 2 years. You only used for 48 and 49. The cover on the right was used from 50 to 58. I thought some interesting things about these, this edition of the handbook was that it was the first handbook to have lashings. Some of these things, it was like, wow, they didn't have it before then, because, in my handbook, of course they did. This was the first handbook to have do a good turn daily. I thought that was interesting. I didn't know that. So there's 12 variations possible of the first cover. There's 14 variations possible of the second cover, which is a total of 26 variations. Once again, it's hard to know the exact, based on what I was going off of, it's hard to tell exactly how many of each variation were printed, because for up until 1950, so up through the first cover, they exist in 1 to 4 stars. So you have a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star. I heard of somebody had one that didn't have a star on it. I don't know if that's just an error or what, but most of them are 1 to 4 stars. And so the print runs on these average over 230,000, roughly, right? Over 230,000. If you just divide it, total number of variations into total number of this edition printed, that's about what you end up with. So you can still tell 230,000 of these books versus, we were talking in a print run was 5 to 10,000 of the original edition. It still gives you some perspective on scarcity. So in the 6th edition, which this is just a wonderful cover, this was the first cover that Norman Rockwell painted specifically to be a handbook cover. And it was done because it was the Boy Scout 50th anniversary. Now, it was kind of interesting that he painted the figure himself, but he didn't paint any of the background. Someone else did that. Someone else did all the background work. And apparently Norman Rockwell was so time crunched on painting this that apparently he painted the belt backwards on the figure, which I would have never noticed unless somebody had pointed it out to me. But this cover was used from 59 to 65. It was written by Greenbar Bill. And this is the first handbook that is a single author handbook. Now, some people will argue, well, what about original edition? And it's like, well, not really. It was really a combined of Seton and Baden-Powell stuff. So even when Seton took Baden-Powell off of it and had his own name on it, it still really was a combined effort. But this was really the first written by William Hillcourt, Greenbar Bill, first single author handbook. There's 8 possible varieties. None of them are really different. There's no really different cover or anything. Just really different ads and some revisions to the rank requirements. The print runs, the first one, or no, all of them were 525,000, except for the 7th, which was only 200,000. And that was probably because that was when they had the new rank requirements came out, and then they immediately switched editions. You'll see in the next couple editions, I believe, that it's usually the first print run, they would print a lot more of them and then print fewer in subsequent print runs. So here's the 7th edition. This cover art was by Dom Lupo, who I'd never heard of, but I like it. It looks good enough. The 7th edition came out right after that revision in 1965 to the rank requirements. Other than that, there were pretty minimal changes to the text. There's 7 possible variations. The print runs are between 600 to 750,000, except for the 7th of 235. So I was wrong. It was it must be the next one where they started doing the first print run having a lot in the initially, and then fewer subsequents. So combined, the 6th and 7th are really similar editions. It's really just the cover and some of the rank requirements. But combined, they have a total of 8.2 million handbooks produced, which is a lot. Here's the 8th edition, 1972 to 1979. The first cover is not inspired. Let's just say that. It was not well liked in general, from what I understand. The second cover art is by Joseph Casari. He passed away in April this year. This is his 1976 painting, All Out for Scouting. It was a pretty radical change in the handbook. And obviously I didn't live during this time period, so I was just going off the material I was looking at. But this was supposed to be the improved scouting program. Basically, the improved scouting program put a de-emphasis on camping. There was a lot more inner city subject matter covered. The person I was reading who was discussing this basically said it was a disaster. That it was just an unmitigated disaster of a handbook. And so, but this was the first handbook of all things that featured the Scout handclasp, which once again is just something that I kind of took for granted. I never really even considered that. These handbooks were printed in a cheaper way. So you'll notice, especially on these, a lot of them are printed on recycled paper. That paper is like, I don't know if it's really acidic or what it is, but it's like over time it turns very yellowish and just looks really bad. It looks really cheap. If you don't know that that's going to be there like that, you kind of think that it's stained or that it's just, you think something's wrong with it because over time it's just not aged well. That's mainly the white covers that are so bad on that. But the binding is also really bad on these. The person I was researching some of this information on described the type of binding is basically the same thing the same style binding you would get on a pad of paper, like on a notepad. That is just a very cheap style of binding. So there's 3 possible variations of the first cover art, 2 possible variations of the second cover art. The first cover, which were the first ones of this edition printed, there were a bunch made. The first print run was 1.5 million, and then the 2 subsequent print runs were 500,000 each. The second cover, there were between 350,000 and 600,000. I think those were the 2 numbers because there were only 2 print runs. This was when the first printing of this one, the 1.5 million, that was a lot of handbooks. The worst cover, in my opinion, my least favorite cover. I do like this cover. This was, done by Norman Rockwell. He painted this at Schiff. It was for the 1970 Browning Bigelow Scout Calendar painting. It's titled Come and Get It. I just really liked this cover. There actually was a scout from Cape Fear Council who modeled in this photo, and they have a framed, apparently Rockwell paid all these scouts you see here. He paid them for modeling for him in this photo. And so I don't remember why, but he sent 2 checks. And one check was like a $1, just kind of a thank you check. And then the other one was for some more amount of money. I don't remember, $20, $30 or whatever. And the scout from Cape Fear actually has the thank you letter and the $1 check, and a little print of this handbook cover all framed. And it's in their museum. And I just thought that was really cool. But so this was done from 79 to 89. Greenbar Bill came out of retirement to write this. And thank goodness he did, because he basically copied a lot of stuff from the 6th and 7th edition. He basically removed a lot of what the improved scouting program that they came out with in the 8th edition that was so bad. He basically got rid of that and went back to how it was before that. There's 14 possible variations. There's 2 major cover variations, and you can see them pretty easily. The one on the left is all the black. The one on the right is the dark blue and the red. So for the typeface, and the fleur-de-lis changes color too, but those are the 2 big changes. I will note, if you're collecting handbooks, Greenbar Bill, I've never seen him sign a book that he didn't write. I'm sure at some point he did it, but a vast majority of the books you'll find with his signature are either going to be, they're going to be one of the ones he wrote, either one of these or one of the patrol leader handbooks. One of the books he wrote, that's the one that might have a signature, and usually it's like right there, basically the first page or 2, it's right there. He signed them basically all in the same place. And I will say, a Greenbar Bill signed handbook usually brings, multiples more than just a regular whatever handbook. So getting into 10th edition, now I'd never heard of the name Robert Birkby. He was apparently the former director of conservation at Philmont Scout Ranch. But so he wrote several handbooks. He started here with the 10th edition. They came out in 1990 to 1998. We don't have an identified artist for the cover art, probably because it's more or less kind of like a collage of art for the front and back cover. It's these photographs. They didn't attribute this to anybody. And the program is basically the pre-1972 scouting program is basically what they went to. But this was the edition that they had 900 color photographs in the handbook. There's 8 possible variations, no real differences, print run to print run. They're all, more or less the same. 300,000 to 500,000 in each production run. So then you have the 11th edition handbook, came out in 1998, used to 2009. This was my handbook. I remember when they changed it at the very tail end of my scouting career, but this was the handbook I started with. And it was written by Robert Birkby. Advancement requirements were updated April 1st, 1999. Personal fitness became mandatory as Eagle required merit badge. I thought that was cool. This was the first handbook to mention GPS, and it had the new leave no trace outdoor ethic that scouting was implementing, which I thought was interesting because all throughout my scouting time, it was always a big emphasis on leave no trace. And it's one of those things of, without seeing that this was the first handbook that really put it out there, I would have just assumed, well, sure, that, was always part of scouting. So it's just kind of interesting. There's 12 possible variations. Print runs are between 250,000 to 450,000. The first print run was much larger, as they've tended to do for most of these, and it was 750,000. The problem you run into as a handbook collector starts with the tail end of these handbooks. And I wonder if that is some of the reason why modern collectors are very hesitant to attempt to do any sort of like a formal catalog, a definitive catalog, because it's no longer easy to know the information. And that may be it. I don't know. So they stopped putting the printing year and the quantity of the handbooks produced around the 10th printing of the 11th edition. So, the last couple ones of this, they stopped putting that information in there. So, at least as of right now, I don't know how you get that information, and there may be a way to do it, to try to track when there's a new printing of the handbook, so you can track it in some way. Certainly not as easy. You get into the 12th edition, which is the 2010 to 2015. This was written by Robert Birkby. This was the first green handbook. They did that previous edition with the recycled paper, but this was not only 100% recycled paper. It was also chlorine-free, manufacturer. I don't even know why you have to have chlorine-free manufacturing. I didn't even know that was a thing, but apparently it is. And it was like tracked from well-managed and controlled sources, and it was described as being tracked in such a way that even the materials the factories were using, I mean, it was talking about like the ink, just everything, that it all had to be accounted for and be 100% green. It must have been expensive and a pain to do because they didn't do it again after this one. So that would be my guess, is that it just wasn't worth the hassle, whatever was involved. The 12th edition is supposed to be a tribute to the 100 years of the Boy Scouting Handbook. Basically, it's been described to me as not somebody's favorite. The person I was using to really do some research on this, they say that, the cover, you can kind of see these specks in the letter of Scout. Those specks are continued throughout the whole book. And they said it was just distracting, that it was just like these specks on every page throughout the whole book. And that it has a lot of quotes and art from previous handbook editions, which, someone like us, we like history, we'd probably enjoy it. 11, 12, 13-year-old kids, young scouts, not sure how much they care about a quote from a previous handbook or a piece of art from a previous handbook. It just may not be very relevant to their scouting journey. So some of that was considered a little distracting from what the handbook was actually trying to inform the readers. But I did think it was interesting that this was the first handbook to have its own website, and that it's referenced at the bottom of a lot of the pages to try to have that web interaction with the youth, which I thought was interesting. There's 23 possible variations. A big one that you can choose to collect or not to collect, but there is a Spanish edition of the handbook, and the cover is slightly different. Basically, where it says the Boy Scout Handbook, it says something like El Boy Scout Handbook. I mean, it's a very minor change. But if you wanted to collect the Spanish version, it's a neat one. When I was collecting every edition, that's how I did it. The first print run was 700,000, but we don't have numbers or printing information on any of the subsequent print runs. So we have no idea how many were produced or when they were produced. But we know it was used to about 2015. Now in 2016 to 17, they used the cover on the left. The big difference is you have the Scout with the bicycle and the eagle. Now in 17, they switched that over, and they got rid of the kid on the bicycle, replaced it with the 3 kneeling scouts, and they put in this model rocket. And the assumption is that they had to take out the eagle, because if the eagle was in the same spot, it looked like you were shooting the bottle rocket up to hit the eagle. So that's why they changed the cover. So there are 2 covers of the 13th edition of the handbook. One of those covers, the 2016 one, was only used for 1 year, but we don't know how many were printed, but we would assume it was a very large print run because it was the first one. So, 500, 750,000, some number. So even though it was only printed for 1 year, it's probably not that scarce. This one was actually written by Mark Ray. Even though he pulled a lot of sections from the previous book, it's a different author, which I thought was interesting. This is the first time since 1990 that the handbook shows a scout in full uniform. You would have thought every handbook you'd want to see a scout in full Class A uniform. STEM was one of the big promotions they put in this book, and if you're still active in the program now, you know that STEM is really being pushed. It's all the history references, all the stuff about it being the 100th year of the handbook, all that stuff that were in the 12th edition, that's all gone in this edition. So, and we have no idea, besides these 2 covers, what other possible varieties there are. Then you have the 14th edition. So this is the current edition. So this was issued from starting in 2019. It's still being issued. This was the second book written by Mark Ray. So I thought this was interesting. Only the second handbook not to have a full cover picture. 8th edition is the other one, which you may remember as being the other ugly handbook. The program name was changed from Boy Scouts of America to Scouts BSA, which, right across the top, Scouts BSA, even though it says Boy Scouts of America at the bottom. We don't know how many possible variations there are of these. That being said, most of the differences are minor between the Handbook for Girls and Handbook for Boys. It was apparently discussed about doing a non-gender specific, so just gender neutral handbook. And apparently they didn't like that. They wanted to do a girl one and a boy one, so they did that. So I suppose pronouns and things are different. There's actually a list on a website I'll show you that has all the differences between the two handbooks. One of the main ones that I thought was interesting is that they just basically changed all the art. So anything that had boys in the boy edition has girls in the girl edition. And some of the drawn art, the reference site I was looking at, they were talking about that some of the girls, they literally took the same picture of the boy and they just drew longer hair. It seemed very odd to me that there's two, but anyways, I noticed as I was putting this together that there is a little bit of a difference in 14th edition that you can collect, and that has to do with the newest change. So at the bottom of the page of these, you'll notice they've changed Boy Scouts of America, bottom of the cover, to Scouting America. So I don't know when these actually released, but I'm assuming very, close to now. I noticed it when I was going through and setting this up. These are now available on the national website, national shop. So this is the newest edition. Is there any printings in between? I don't know. I have no idea. I do want to talk very briefly about hardbound handbooks. This is where I kind of had more interest for quite a while when I was keeping stuff. Johnny talked about how when I was going to shows, I'll buy all the books that are $1. And for a long time there, I was buying all the handbooks that were $1. I realized quite quickly I was coming home with a lot of handbooks, and every now and then I'd see a hardbound handbook. I was buying hundreds of handbooks at some of these shows. Sometimes from one person, I would buy 100 or more handbooks. And I realized that the percentage of hardbound handbooks I was having come in was drastically lower than the softbound. I am not exaggerating. I know some of you probably think I am prone to exaggeration, but I promise you I'm not in this case. I would think on the low side of things, being conservative, that I got maybe one hardbound handbook for every 100 softbound handbooks. It's that much of a disparity. Now the hardbound handbooks, my understanding is that we have no print run knowledge on how many were actually produced of those. So they've always just been kind of counted within the larger print run number. But think about it this way. How many kids did you know going through scouting that had a hardbound handbook? I didn't know any. My scoutmaster, no one had a hardbound handbook. No one had that. And so, in my experience, no one values hardbound handbooks nearly what they should probably be valued at. Like I said, a 1970s hardbound handbook, you can find one for $10 or $20. You might find a regular softbound one for $5. But you'll find 100 softbound ones for that one hardbound one. At least that's my experience. So that's just a note on their scarcity. A note on just some complexity with them, because they are... So look at this one on the left. It's a 1915. It's a second edition. It's not a first edition. It's a second edition handbook. But the binding is a hardbound of the first edition cover. So it's like they printed the second edition. They had some of these bindings made up that were hardbound bindings, and they put it on it, but it's actually a first edition binding on a second edition handbook, and that's how it was issued. But so, and these handbook for boys from the Every Boys Library, there's a number of those that were made for multiple years, and they're just very hard to actually document. You actually have to really look at, okay, it's this many pages, it has these ads in it, it has this, it has this, it has this, to try to figure out which one it is, what year it is, because they don't all, like the 1914 one doesn't say which printing it is in it. You have to just kind of figure it out. The 1919 thankfully does say which printing it is. But because they weren't standard, you have like this 1959 over here. I've had a couple come in. I think that was how they were issued, but they also issued a hardbound handbook that was more almost a copy of what the regular handbook was. And that's not even to speak on the fact that some places, like a library, they would get in a handbook and they would have it library bound, right? They would have, the library would bind it. And some of those are done so well that, at least for me as a novice, I look at them and go, well, is this a national issue or is this a library edition issue? So I will say, I think that value wise, I would value a national edition, a national issue, much more than just something the library did. But some of the library ones are really nicely done. I'll also mention, especially as we get to newer stuff, they started making a lot more special. We're going to make up a special handbook for such and such. There's a presidential edition handbook. There's a lot of numbered edition handbooks that they just sold for a higher amount of money. You can notice the one on the left is just a presentation edition of the 1979 handbook handed out from Great Western Council. The one on the right is the library edition handbook. Apparently they started doing library editions and basically just charged a lot of money for them. I think original MSRP was like $100, and then when they switched editions from 13th to 14th edition, they discounted them at, eventually they were like $20 to buy, or $25 plus shipping, something like that, which is when I bought one. But some of these are just, so all of those should have a future presentation, I suppose. But my point is that the pool is very deep on the hardbound handbooks, and if you come across them and you want to collect them, I would, especially the early ones, which are just impossible, but even the later ones, if you can pick them up and just keep them, and they're $10, $20, $30, I think any of them are a great buy, to pick up to keep. Finally, this is the reference site that I just want to crow about. I mean, this is just, oh my goodness. I don't know who does this. It's troop97.net. That's who it is. And this is just their troop website out of Fort Collins, Colorado. And on the left, you can see it. There's some little headings there, and you can see one of them is BSA Handbook Information, Scout Handbook, Scoutmaster Handbook, Patrol Leader Handbook, Field Book, and then it talks about covers. This is the site that I learned everything from. Everything I've learned has basically come from this site. Some of the details on some of the printing and varieties I've learned from Todd Kelly, because I would consider him an expert on handbooks, and he shared some information with me that was just really exceptional in terms of some of the varieties of the handbooks. But if you want to get into handbook collecting, this is the site to go to. And as far as I'm aware, it is absolutely the best site for anyone interested in handbook collecting. And whoever runs this, I have no idea who, deserves all the credit for this entire presentation and so much more.
I was going to traderies in the early 90s, and nobody bought books and paper. And I just would walk around and I'd pick things up, what I thought, at bargain basement prices. I'm embarrassed to say what I paid for some things, and thank God I can't remember with most of it. So, but the reality is in book collecting is this. Um, in the Boy Scout world, people were making decisions about the words additions and variations without fully appreciating, understanding either book collecting or the printing process itself. So, in fact, what we get is we get, in some cases, abominations of terms and words that are used to describe things that really isn't quite accurate. And I'll give you a quick point. In the book collecting world, um, we use the word first edition. That generally means first printing. So if we were to identify a third or a fourth printing, we would say first edition, third printing. And even though the third printing is still a first edition, it's not the first printing. And generally speaking, first printings are more desirable. Remember, though, rule number one, there are printings that are much more desirable than the first printing. Not many, but there are some. The other part of that is there are what we refer to as states. So and that's as in the state of New Hampshire, but it means in the state of a book. So in fact, a first edition could have two or three, or in a few cases, even more states. Now, a state is defined as a variation within the printing, but does not bring the variation to the point of a new edition, but it occurs during the print run. An example is sometimes somebody on the printing line may realize that there's a word spelled wrong and they'll correct it, or that the press actually dropped a word and they would reinsert it. But they don't, I mean, they may stop the press to make the change, but it doesn't stop the print run itself. So, and states not are usually not a definition of, if I said first edition, second state, I may not actually know which state comes first. It, and it's irrelevant in the book collecting world. If if we know that something came first, then in fact we actually don't use the word state. We're more likely to say first printing, first version or variation, and the second is another print. And it depends whether the change brought it to a new edition. Now, the question of what changes an edition comes into play here. An edition change in the book world and in the printing world generally has to be someplace, and it's not an exact science, but someplace around 15 to 25% of the content has to change in order for there to be to define it as a new edition. Now, in the Boy Scout handbooks, those changes are very often really clear, and so that the variation of a new or the printing of a new edition is clear because the content is dramatically changed. It's not just the cover has changed, and in fact, to reference that, when a cover changes, that can occur during a print run itself. So you could have a first edition with a first state cover or a second state cover. They're both still first editions. And in that case, when there's a cover change, there can be, you can usually identify which comes first. But when there's word content change or other things within the printing process, we don't always know that. So those that kind of definition or defining of words becomes really important. Um, and unfortunately, our the people who have made those identifying moments of changing of editions. And you're correct. You can pick up, I think it's the 1940 edition, and it really doesn't even talk about it being the fourth edition or the fifth edition. It just says the 45th printing. Um, And in fact, that's an inaccurate statement because there is actually it's a change in content that's big enough that it's a new edition. So those some of those things actually still need to be worked out in terms of going back, and a meeting of the minds have to come and say, listen, let's be clear about this. Now, speaking of being clear, I just want everybody who didn't see or doesn't know, Larry, there's your kahuna. All right. Now, this is the first printing of the kahuna. I must have picked this up in 1989. And it was the very first time I said to myself, oh my God, this is much worse than I ever imagined. So, so it's, and I just want to make, you talked about collecting every printing. I looked at that question early on in my collecting habits, and hear me, I had hundreds, if not thousands, but certainly hundreds of different printings of handbooks. And I said to myself, why?
That was
This
always
is,
my question of
yeah,
why
yeah.
it never
Now,
spoke to
there is
me.
a reason, there is an answer to that question in terms of if you're building a reference library that is going to be used for research, then in fact, every printing becomes important because you need to identify changes in in terms of content and where things happen. And hear me, the Boy Scouts of America, as we all understand, reflects our culture in from our own countries. It's not just the American culture, there's the Canadian culture, there's the English culture, there's every country has its own culture and every country has its own handbook, and it goes on and on and on. Um, but so every printing can have value. Does every collector need to collect every printing? I don't think so. And I certainly, truthfully, I never aspired to that one myself. I mean, basically, I've tried to address some of the philosophical things, but I do want to point out a couple, I think, maybe factual things that if I can offer some clarity on some things, and other people could have other opinions, but when you show those four covers um, with of the handbooks, the one on the right, um, if you want to bring that up, if you got it right there, it's the one the
Let
four
me
cover you had a 1911, and then on the right there was what you refer to as library binding, which no back in the
oh, this
present,
one.
yeah, yes. So the one on the right there, that is actually a library binding. So let me explain how those occurred. There's more than one company that did work for libraries. So a library would get a book in, and the book, and they're buying it from the publisher, and the book doesn't have what's we would refer to as a sturdy binding. So in the 50s and 60s, libraries, for some reason, felt they needed to spend money and create a more sturdy binding. I think it was really inexpensive to do. And these print houses would take the books in bulk and strip off the old covers. I'm assuming they threw them away. And they would put on, quote, a sturdy library binding. And they did an extremely poor quality of reproducing the cover. And what you're looking at there on the right is that. And so that book was not originally published for libraries, but the libraries themselves was paying to have them rebound into a sturdy binding so that they would stand up to usage within the library. Um,
Well, that's
and
great to know.
yeah,
I know I've seen some before where you could tell. Like I've had some before where it was like you could tell it was like a stripped off, soft cover, and it was like you know just put over like turned into a dust cover. With like
yes,
you know.
yep. Oh, there were wide varieties of those. The merit badge pamphlets, and our expert on merit badge pamphlets can probably confirm this for me, but that hardcover of the merit badge pamphlets that was done in the 40s and 50s. That's a library rebound for the most part. Um, the So again, the libraries wanted a sturdy book, and that's how they would create them. So there's a lot of those out there that are just library rebinds. My opinion is that the Boy Scouts of America sold hardcover books. Very few of them. I think you're 100% accurate. One hardcover for every 100 may be exactly accurate, and it actually could even be more. Hardcover books. I've been doing this almost 65 years, and the, getting a complete collection of hardcover books from all the printings is near impossible. Because some of them I've never seen, but I know they exist. I'm very certain that they exist out there, but they are very hard and scarce. So now, in the modern term, I do think they are making books for library distribution, but that was not the case back in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. Maybe by the 50s, they were doing a little bit of that, but I think the library rebinds to suggest not the case. I don't think it's till the 80s when they start producing things for the libraries themselves. That's my opinion. By the way, just as a footnote, that's a leatherette cover, not a leather cover. I would describe as a fox leather, FAUX. Just as a comment. And I do think you're correct on the two checks, by the way. I think Norman Rockwell by that point knew that people collected his signature. And so he was offering the the individuals that he was paying basically a gift, saying, keep the $1 check, frame it, do whatever you want, because that's going to be worth more than what I'm paying you for. And so I think that was probably the thinking behind that. To be no question in my mind. Um, the um, the other thing I just would also say, to be clear, book collecting is not patch collecting. Um, I know in patch collecting, and I have done a little bit of it, even though my focus has not been there. Um, you do not necessarily in the book collecting have to collect every variation or every printing. And in fact, just a little point of clarity, somebody will bring me a book at a book show sometimes, and they'll say, "Oh, look at this rare book! It's bound upside down." In the book collecting world, we don't care that it's bound. Matter of fact, we really consider that just a print error. It's been somebody turned the book wrong when they were binding it, and it's not an upside down Jenny. It's a book bound poorly, is what it is. And in the book collecting world, it cheapens the value. It does not increase its value.